Oh, thank you so much, Shirley. And of course, a good evening to all. Jan, if you can open up the landing slide for me, that would be great. Whilst I just say something quickly about the thought processes, which I think it's more or less almost 20 years old. I see Breitner and some other colleagues here as well. So good to see you too. Um, I have now just completed the chapter on racism's knowledge for a book Shirley and I are putting together. The manuscript is complete. It took a while, like like all books, much longer than we should, but it should be going into the processes very soon, and it will, in all probability, be a 2025 publication. We have also just brought out the book on emancipatory imaginations on critical university studies, which of course also had a long, long history. And the reason why I'm sharing this is that the idea that knowledge belongs to racism um, did emerge as a huge, huge battle in my own space because its implications are just so substantive, and almost very difficult to fathom in the context of the work that we're trying to do. But I thought, let me put this out, and I'll explain a bit why it differs from our general understanding of racism and knowledge. So it's racism's knowledge. Slide two, please, Jan. So in this chapter, Luan and I, of course, with some support of Shelley's work as well, and others, which I will acknowledge towards the end, we argue that the epistemic battles in the university associated with racism and knowledge, and racism in knowledge, and the production of racism through knowledge may be read as racism's ownership of disciplinary knowledge, i.e., disciplinary knowledge belongs to racism. So we are not simply arguing because this has been done for many, many decades now. So we are not simply arguing that racism has infiltrated knowledge and its producers, but rather that racism a priori determines the trajectory which our research is taking, i.e., it provides the conceptual and programmatic coordinates for our knowledges. And this includes our own work in the context of our efforts to be anti-racist and our efforts to be pro-social justice. So the nature and the structure of the relationship between racism and knowledge vary across the different types of domains and the different knowledge spheres. But there is no doubt that at the interface of knowledge and racism, that all disciplines are touched by this particular interface. But we also acknowledge that there are work that contests this particular interface, and we'll show how difficult it is for this work to come into being in the institutional and sectoral consciousness of higher education. So there are exceptions, but it seems that even our radical and critical work, as it opposes racism, it seems that there's almost like a gravitational pull uh, of this particular knowledge back into the orbit of racism. And the same is true for sexism on so many, many fronts, and some of the work being done by Shirley is what I mobilize for it, of course. So we suggest that racism's ownership of knowledge materializes as an apparatuses that integrates all our differences and divides, whether it's historical, cultural, ethnic, racial, socioeconomic, as well as our political and intellectual personalities and positionalities and class sensibilities and aspirations. So it merges that into an interpretive horizon that steers the unceasing racialization of knowledge. That is, in the context of the academy and the production of knowledge within the academy, no one stands outside of this particular nexus. And we then further attempts to show in this particular chapter that our own knowledges, and even as it claims a social justice import, they are generally at risk of being recruited back into racism's jurisdiction or sexism's jurisdiction, depending on what type of knowledge domains you are working in. So the massive challenges and debates, for instance, within the decolonization of higher education field is a testimony to this gravitational pull. And I don't, want to preempt certain kinds of responses to it, but I would like to just avoid some crude misreadings. So, so I just want to put 5 points out very quickly. The one is that we are focusing on disciplined and formalized knowledges and not other knowledge formation. So certainly there exist undisciplined and unruly knowledges and dissident knowledges in different kinds of spaces. That's not our reference point. Second, and can you put in slide 3 now, Jan, please? Second, our key argument is that knowledge belongs to racism, but that such ownership is not unqualified and incontestable. Yet, we are trying to highlight the steering power of the knowledge racism interface within the sector so that we can avoid a fluffy reflexivity or a fluffy agency to which we so quickly run because we are scared of the arduous, fugitive, demanding, and sometimes even self annihilating work that we are required to do to work against the racism knowledge interface. Can we then go to slide 4, Jan, please? And third, racism's knowledge takes, of course, various formulations across the disciplines, and the conscious and unconscious mobilization of racism for racialized ends cuts across the sciences. And then the fourth point is that we are all interpolated into racism's project and are required to work through and with our own epistemic corruptions. So, however, our responsibilities, especially in the context of anti-Black racism, is historically and differentially distributed. That is the historical processes by which racism has been and is shaped, determines the differentiated ways in which culpability and accountability are distributed across our, there's a bit of noise.
Remember, kukho abantu abangu-in out bakule transport
in Jan, I don't know why we're getting someone else in the talk. Are all of the mics off?
Because it's consideration izinto guys. Kukho abantu that abawa bevuka noSiya mna nami ndifike
Giselle says she's unmuted.
I have now muted that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
And then, of course, so the argument here is that there is a kind of accountability and complicity on the racism knowledge interface across our various divides, but it is a shared, not an equal complicity. I know in previous years, my work has been misunderstood as presenting an equal complicity, which is not the case. It's actually not a word and a concept that I use, and sometimes people critique your work by inventing concepts in their own heads. But okay, that's for a different debate. And then the last point, as an introduction, is that we are not blind to the multitude of factors that come into play through the establishment and development of the disciplines. And we, of course, are not touching on that because that work has already been done. So the implications for our arguments suggest a fundamental rethinking of academic structures and the knowledges, but especially our individual roles within it. So, in other words, we're trying to figure out a way in which we can work towards a more radicalized form of decolonization capable of solidaristic relationalities that not only offer a real challenge to racism, but also generate the necessary condition for advancing two indivisible imperatives at the same time. On the one hand, we have the equity, equality, and redress imperative, and on the other hand, we have the planetary well-being imperative. Our argument here is that if we don't bring those two imperatives together, the question around, the arguments, for instance, on climate change is certainly not going to be redressed. Neither would, any of the, objectives of the SDGs, for instance, be met if the sustainability, discourse is not matched with an anti-discriminatory imperative. Okay, so those two runs together. And we argue that the scaffolding for that particular kind of thinking resides within the kind of, clustering of Black studies, which of course has its historical, trajectories, the Black radical tradition, and but also, of course, a thoughtful and critical discourse on decolonization, including critical indigenous studies, of course, as well. Slide 6, please, Jan. So we are further informed by the contemporary intensification of global racism and its articulation with the knowledge racism nexus. So we all know what kind of future is approaching us now at the current moment as far as global racism is concerned. But we are also troubled within the academy itself as far as the question of reflection studies are concerned. So, whilst the academy is littered with reflection studies, its contributions to shifts in the structure and practices of the academy is not only insignificant, but counterproductive. So, for instance, there in the literature, there is not an apparent connection between the claims of reflection studies on the one hand and the claims of transformation and social justice work on the other hand, and as a third area of work, individual chains and the anti-racism and decolonial project as well. So it appears that that particular disconnect feeds into the racism knowledge interface. The second point in this regard is also that it appears that critical study of race and racism as it relates to universities appears to be taking a back seat. There are so many of that work that is not coming through that actually should, especially in the current context, be firmly on our radar. So the chapter, and especially its title, is meant as a provocation, transgression, and like an indictment in the context of how the academy operate. Slide 7, please, Jan. So one of the ways in which we read the different types of technologies around racism's knowledge, relates to the way in which the intensification of racism currently suggests its interpellative power. So we all probably know, Louis Althusser's theory on ideology, who argues that all ideology hails or interpolates concrete individuals as concrete subjects by the functioning of the category of the subject itself. This means that ideology operates then at the level in which individuals come to understand themselves as subjects. So we propose that in line with Althusser, of course, which was also a Fanonian argument, that any definitional framework for racial should include the racial process of interpolation by which racialized subjects are constructed. Now, renowned critical race scholar, educationist, Zues Leonardo argues, using Althusser, that the ideology of race and its associated discourses interpolate every human individual into the racial formation. She is signified and brought into the racial universe, which gives her a racial label, white or otherwise. A person or society, so Leonardo continues, immerse in race, like South Africa and of course the US and Canada. A society immersed in race cannot think outside of it, which represents the racialization of reality and the realization of race itself. That is, we are all to varying degrees in the academy interpolated into into racism's project through the process of racialization as well. So this process of hailing is entangled with a range of interrelated contestations within higher education, and especially how it relates to the political economy of the university, predatory racial capitalism, the ensnarement of the university within a modern colonial neoliberal imaginary, and of course various other challenges that the universities are facing as well. And these are realities, of the sector on this side of the Atlantic as well as on your side of the Atlantic. So we, of course, are forced to read the reality of racial thinking in a way by which we are steered to do so because we cannot escape the manifestation of race as a concept. Now, the problem of race, so famously captured by Du Bois, is the problem of the 20th century, has projected itself from the past, present into an unending future as one of the most wicked challenges of all times. One that is closely tied to the current planetary, socioeconomic, and environmental crisis that we are facing, in addition to the global inequalities that are more or less, being a scar on the international world map as well. And so recent reports and studies on so many fronts, whether it's the World Justice Project, the Special Rapporteur, of the United Nations, shows a particular new polarization emerging in the world and the intensification of racism, and of course also emerged even in reports like that of the World Economic Forum as, one of the top 5 risks, together with climate change, artificial intelligence, and of course, technological advances as well. So even what one would regard as conservative surveys, argue for this particular, argument that we are putting forward here as well. So the question that we then have to think through relates to especially Cedric Robinson's groundbreaking concept of racial capitalism that challenges the notion that capitalism and racial hierarchy are separate entities. Of course, that work for all of us interested in the race and racism studies, we would be, knowledgeable about that as well. And these kinds of ways in which racial capitalism has played itself out, especially in countries like the USA, United Kingdom, Canada, the Netherlands, and so on, also produced a racialized democracy, which of course is also the political formation of the economic order into which racism is tied, which presents itself now in your part of the world a bit more pronounced than on our side. But of course, our own democracy is also rooted in ethno-nationalist discourses and can also be regarded as a racialized democracy as well. Now, Breitner, we should not, confuse the concept of racialized democracy with the discredited racial democracy of or colorblind doctrine from Brazil and the USA, of course, So that's just want to make that particular, distinction there as well. Check the time. I will probably take another, say, 8 to 10 minutes, and then I should be done. So these discourses, of course, both racial capitalism and racialized democracy at a global level, are reanimated and mirrors the materialization of race as a technology of global economic governance. So global economic governance, as well as the reinscription of the racialized global ordering of the world. So you have racial governance at a planetary level, which of course drives the various sets of racializations and other spheres of the social polity as well. And this is no more, nowhere else clearer than in the operations of powerful governments, multi and transnational industries and businesses, and of course the state's performances of the United Nations Security Council. Of course, there are different agencies within the UN that does much better work than its Security Council, but that's for another debate as well. So racial governance inevitably oversees the global higher education system. And so there's an entire industry built around the racial governance of our university sector that is presumably tied into the way in which we have to follow certain research agendas like that of the SDGs, which are now more or less prescribed research themes for universities. Of course, I don't believe that a university should have a domineering, thematic normative frame, whether it's human rights or whether it's the SDGs. And so it then more or less interpolates us into these institutions, their discourses, the practices, desires, infrastructures, and of course also the cultural artifacts, our sciences, our economies. And in that process, reform our subjectivities to align with these particular objectives that is set out as well. So race is then understood as a set of political relations, and it necessitates a diverse array of settings for its continuation, and universities are key settings within this particular project as well. Slide 8, please. Let me just quickly hurry up, of course. So in the Foucauldian sense then, the power knowledge is of course co-constitutive. They are mutually independent of one another, and I don't have to repeat that argument here. But Luan and I would like to add, so it's power, knowledge, racism as a nexus, okay? Just to suggest that the propriety relationship between racism and knowledge is produced and reproduced within the nexus of those three elements as well. And racism's knowledge, it seems to us at least that the disciplines in the university shares a unique connection to the racism project. Now there's many books been written about philosophy, anthropology, the natural sciences, and all of those as well, which we don't want to focus on here as well. So we chose two examples to show how some of our work that we think as social justice work, intersectionality, and African studies, how they are being recruited back into racism's orbit. If you think, for instance, in the work that Salma Bulja has done around the whitening of intersectionality, there's also some work, that we are doing at our own university through the Center for Women and Gender Studies that has a critical eye on the different ways in which feminist work is being, supported and produced within the academy as well. So the power of the disciplines, of course, is one of the areas of work of interest that we have. And that particular power produced a certain kind of racial gravity, which pulls everybody into its formations as well. So The question that we then have, and Shirley, what I have decided is not to go into the case studies to argue the point, but rather, just mention what case studies we have pursued, and of course some kinds of alternative options available to us. Because I do think that the paper will probably say it much better than I can say at the present moment. But in our, preparation for writing this piece of work and the different sets of analysis that we have undergone in this, there are, of course, a number of studies that one can show that even if they argue for a progressive import, they return back to racism's influence, after different kinds of ways. In fact, some strands of decolonization, for instance, in the university, some strands of those have similar risk involved. And of course, that's the kind of caution that we would like to put on the table as well. Slide 9, please, Jan. So within the disciplines, both the question of resistance are already made provision for a priori within the disciplines, i.e., the disciplines have no problem, in having an anti-racist project within its formation because it can easily disciplines it. There's a big study in South Africa that shows how the decolonization project has been bureaucratized and disciplined into conservative forms, across a study of 11 universities. Very, very sobering in the way in which institutional arrangements undercut progressive thought and areas of work. And that's the other caution that we put on the table, and we include our own work in that as well. So the rethinking of the academic structures, of course, and then I also think that sometimes we are not honest enough as academics with regard to how we engage scholarly work, how our affective desires is tied up with our material architectures and our different sets of sensibilities that more or less produce the disciplines and the university as is. And so what we then put on the table is a way in which we more or less have to take Black studies out of its dominant space of North America and provide for a much, much stronger and critical conversation, between decolonial studies here on the African continent, African feminist imagination on the African continent, and of course, Black studies on our continent in conversation with the Black radical tradition in other parts of the world, inclusive, of course, of critical indigenous studies as well. So there is a body of knowledge and epistemic frames that already provide pathways for how to unburden ourselves from the clutches of racism's knowledge. So can I go to slide 10, please, Jan? And then perhaps I think I've done slide 10, slide 11. So the idea around the examples and case studies that we draw on the existing archives, we look at the materialization of race as a technology of economic governance, and the two examples which I referred to earlier is intersectionality in African studies. There's others that we would wanted to pursue, but of course, we have to keep it just a bit more manageable. But we'll do some of that work at a later stage as well, just to show the cautions that we need to apply when we engage with our own epistemic positions, which maybe we think of it in progressive terms, but its programmatic expressions does the opposite. Next slide, please, Jan. Jan. And then, of course, the next slide, please. And that's the last one. So the interesting thing for us is that there are also, no, please, back. The counter examples are there. And of course, Shirley's work is a great example of, that, no, please, slide 11, slide 12, I mean. Oh, I'm struggling now with the slide. It's just the one before the end, Jan. Oh, and I need the slide to be able to explain what I'm trying to say.
Oh, well, we have time. You're
Yeah,
fine.
there you are. Okay, there you are. Please keep it for that for a moment, please. So the interesting, of course, insights for us is that none of the scholars that we think are doing counterexamples, i.e., efforts at dislodging from racism's disciplinary hold, they don't frame it in the notion of racism's knowledge. They have other ways of framing it. But of course, that's how we read their work. Shirley's own work is a good example of those. And then, of course, the Hani Moten work, and especially the trilogy from Fred Moten as well. It's amazing work around the question of either, fugitivity or the epistemology of the undercommons, or in Shirley's work, the, maroon epistemology. So that's a different, there's other ways in which we can think this particular project as well. Then we also have Babalwa at our university with another colleague who reflected on, I think it was the sociology conference in Australia, but there's an oeuvre of work in our Center for Women and Gender Studies that also indicates ways in which their work can escape, the patriarchal hold, of knowledge over the disciplines of, so that's work, and that includes, of course, Pumla Gawala's work as well. And then in psychology, we have, Kopano Ratele's work. Hugo Canham has also produced a great piece of work now on Mpondo theory, which looks at some of a region here close to us on this side of the world as well, but with very, very interesting ways in thinking this. And then, of course, Chilumbembe, who has been very clear about the interconnectedness between racism and planetary health. Okay. His latest small little book on, I think, the earthly community is a very, very, useful, explanation of how those are connected on so many fronts as well. But I must say that in our space, through the work of the center, that even the center, even if it argues for progressive African feminist traditions, in their own work, they also, are under scrutiny by themselves for the way in which some of those traditions within their knowledge domain is part of a colonizing system of knowledge as well. So that's another case study that one can pursue as to how one, almost on a tentative, critical basis, engage with your own epistemic positions, so that you are more acutely aware of how you reproduce the ownership of racism over knowledge. And the chapter itself, of course, provides for better description of these examples as to how one can do this particular kind of work. Right, so colleagues, let me leave it like that, Shirley, and then we can then take a few questions if there are anybody who wants to come back on this.